America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
Is the political temperature in America running high? Is it in the danger zone? Political violence is increasing. Frankly, there's not a lot of research and data available. That said, the assassination of a Minnesota lawmaker and the attempted murder of another are a somber wake-up call that indicate we may be entering an era of increasing political violence. Welcome to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Joining me, political analyst Sean Frieder. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Always glad.
So, John, a man disguised as a police officer attacked two Democratic legislators at their homes, killing a state representative and her husband, and wounding another lawmaker and his wife. Police say the alleged murderer was planning to attack other local politicians and abortion rights activists. In California, protesters surrounded a car and the driver drove over a protester's leg. A man in Arizona was arrested after flashing a gun at protesters. Police investigated anti-Muslim threats against mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani. Is political violence increasing?
It's a few different ways that we can measure it, and by all these metrics, it looks like it probably is. We can look at direct violent acts. That seems to be going up. We can look at the incidence of threats against officials, activists, et cetera. That also seems to be going up. And we can also just look at, which is probably the easiest to measure, broad political support for political violence in the United States, which we've seen some evidence, if not necessarily going up, is at least higher than we'd like it to be.
There's also the fact that we see more of it on social media. We see it on the newscasts. Are we just more aware, or was it always there?
I think to a certain extent we're more aware. I think to a certain extent parts of the internet that are more likely to put violent rhetoric out there can kind of rile themselves up in a way that they didn't used to be able to. If, the main thing is that violence is something that's a pretty rare thing to do. Almost no one's doing it, but when it does happen, it makes a huge commotion. So violence, if you were 40 years ago, you might be sitting alone thinking violent thoughts. If you now have the internet, you can find any number of forums where you'll be surrounded by people that are maybe even egging you on to continue having those thoughts or take them one step further.
So it almost feeds itself in a way. The beast feeds itself. In an interview with The Guardian, Robert Pape, a political scientist at the University of Chicago, said, "We are in a historically high period of American political violence. I call it our era of violent populism." It's been about 50 years since we've seen something like this, he says, and the situation is getting worse. What do you think's behind the rise?
So there's a number of things that we could look at. The first is, and it's not too surprising, political science research and psychological research has looked at what leads to political violence. It's really associated with personal aggression more than anything. Now, that's not too surprising. Is a personal aggression on the rise? Probably not. Personality traits are pretty stable. We can look at things like, political change and division. I think that that's somewhat what Pape is referring to. If you go back 50 years, you're in the 60s to the 70s, times of political revolution. So I think to a certain extent, we can look to the times that we're in. Generally, though, I think what causes violence is, if people are upset in their own personal lives. Happy people usually don't commit violence. People that are sad, depressed, lonely, frustrated, angry, they commit violence. So to a certain extent, we can look, I think, at socioeconomic factors. Right after the pandemic, we saw a surge not in political violence necessarily, but violence generally. The pandemic made people more isolated, more sad, more maybe losing their job. These kind of external factors, I think, are a big part of what's happening.
And if you look at psychological studies these days, society in general just doesn't seem to be happy.
No, I mean, again, the main thing psychologists talk about right now is the loneliness epidemic throughout the country, especially for younger people. And if you look at the types of people that commit violent acts, again, young people are not violent, but when you look at violent people, they tend to be maybe 18 to 35. So the people that would be most likely to be impacted by the loneliness epidemic are also the same people we usually see committing violent acts when they occur.
I hate to talk about social media so much, but it paints a false portrait of what life is really like. And, people look at, what life others are living. And they get this false sense of things. And that probably feeds it some, too.
It's a huge problem. I mean, if you're talking about, specifically political violence with your coworkers, which is who you'd probably be talking to, maybe friends, family, coworkers several decades ago, if you're talking about politics at all, you're going to be putting on a best face for that kind of person. If you're on the internet and you're talking to strangers, you're maybe performing for an audience. You're maybe trying to egg people on. You're talking in a way that you wouldn't be talking normally, and it incentivizes the kind of person who has maybe violent rhetoric more likely to come up to be the person talking, maybe rather than staying quiet. You'd see that more 40 years ago.
And you can't have a civil conversation anymore. And sometimes even with family, it gets out of control.
It's definitely extended into the family. We've seen lots of political studies. Thanksgiving dinners are more likely to end early when one member of the family is of a different political persuasion than if they all have the same persuasion. So we see plenty of studies showing that this has gone way beyond anonymous rhetoric online. It is going into friend and family social networks. But I do think social media is one of the big places it starts.
And people aren't open to civil debate. They're not open to listening. They're not open to discussion, and I don't think that helps either.
No, I mean, again, this is something I think is primarily modeled through the internet, and if you talk to younger people where they're seeing, their rhetoric modeled, maybe you'd see it in 40 years ago in politicians, maybe you'd see it in newscasters or things like that. People are increasingly looking to the rest of the populace to sort of see how they're supposed to be acting, and increasingly that's sociopathic ways online that you see a lot of people talk about each other, dehumanizing ways to talk about the other side on social media.
And there's a great deal of apathy out there too, and people just aren't plugged into reality. And I can't think that that's helping.
No, I mean, apathy leads to free time, leads to thinking that the traditional ways of solving problems aren't working. In many ways, they aren't working, but that leads someone that might be particularly aggressive to thinking, if this is not the way that this is going to be handled, maybe there's another way I can handle this.
What do you believe is behind this rise, in addition to the other things that we've talked about? Is it rhetoric? Is it because people aren't independent thinkers? Is it because, other people are influencing them?
I think that there's a variety of factors. There's one thing that people who study this talk about, which is called stochastic terrorism. This is the idea that you as a public figure might not say, I call for the violent death of so-and-so, but you might just say, so-and-so is doing something that's really awful, they're causing America to be destroyed, or these, very evocative ways of speaking. There's maybe 1,000 people out there watching that broadcast. Most people are not going to walk away thinking I need to do something violent. One person might. So as real divisions exist in society, as people maybe even play up fake or not real divisions that exist in society, there's going to be that one person sitting out there that might say, this is the moment that I have to do something about this. And, as an example, Luigi Mangione, this is maybe people could argue if this is political violence, maybe it's economic violence, but this is the person that took down the CEO several months ago. You look at what motivates him, it's, healthcare insurance policies, but also he had debilitating backaches for months. So, I mean, it starts, I think, at a fairly small place. I think it starts at someone's personal experience of life. If they're miserable, they're then looking for reasons why they're miserable. They go looking for solutions that might involve taking people out.
And there's a mental health crisis in this nation, too. That exacerbates the situation.
This is always a huge problem. I mean, when we talk about violence in the United States for a long time now, both sides have talked about the need for further improvements to mental health counseling, many more resources made available for mental health counseling. We've seen little increases here or there in those resources being made available, but nothing like probably the flood of resources that we'd really need to see if you want to make a dent in this problem.
And with the cutback in resources from what just happened with the mega bill, that's not going to help.
No, I mean, where do people turn to for mental health resources? They often have to go through hospitals and doctors, which means going through insurers. And if you are a poorer person, which we just said, that might cause you to be more likely to have issues in your personal life that would cause you to take that next step. You might be depending on Medicaid, and Medicaid is one of the things that was cut in that bill. So as healthcare funding goes down generally, I think that's going to have a specific toll on mental health.
Right, and the theory was that, the states would pick up the slack, but the states don't have the resources, so we're just talking about, problems compounding. An NPR PBS Marist poll taken at the beginning of the month shows that nearly 3/4 of Americans see politically motivated violence as a major problem. That survey discovered the U.S. is having difficulty trying to figure out what it means to be an American these days, as well as who belongs and who doesn't. A lot of people say there's a struggle to decide on the direction this country should take, and the majority of those surveyed have little faith in political leadership. That seems to insinuate political leadership is partly to blame and fueling the problem, or maybe a lack of leadership and a lack of direction?
That's exactly right. I think there's two ways to think about that. One, to the extent that people don't trust politicians, that implies that there's a power vacuum there. That implies that our traditional ways of electing officials and then having them take care of our problems on our behalf, that some people or many people are not perceiving that as really working the same way anymore. So some of this is maybe caused by the lack of trust in traditional channels. I think that there's a second explanation that some of the political rhetoric, some of the political leaders that have become more popular, they are using more heated rhetoric. And so as political polarization rises for a variety of reasons, you see the few people that maybe are trusted intensely by some people using that rhetoric more. That might increase more of what we called before that stochastic terrorism.
So John Lewis, who's a research fellow at George Washington University's program on extremism, he thinks Republican Party leaders shoulder more responsibility for the violent climate. Is one party more responsible than the other?
So there's a few ways to look at this. First, it depends on how you define violence. If we're including things like vandalism, you probably have something like a more even playing field between both parties. There's more incidents of political vandalism. We've seen Teslas vandalized recently, and that's more associated with the left. If we're talking more about violence as actual assaults on human beings, from a few different data sources, the FBI has released a report on this over the last couple years. We've seen a couple other sources say this. You do see maybe more right-wing associated attacks when we talk about pure human-on-human political violence. So if we're talking about violent incidences, I do think that there's somewhat of an asymmetry here. It's not necessarily overwhelming, but it's there. If we're talking about elites that maybe are more responsible for using violent political rhetoric, I think most politicians on both sides aren't really using that rhetoric. I think that if there's any guilt, it might be politicians who aren't sufficiently condemning the use of violent rhetoric. I also think that we can look at specific politicians. Trump would stand out as more likely, more willing to use violent rhetoric. And there's been some studies of his use of rhetoric that have shown that his use of violent rhetoric has increased over the last several years.
But do people also look at Donald Trump and say, that's just Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and does that mitigate some of that?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, I think that the vast majority of people, supporters or detractors looking at his language, they're going to, if they're detractors, condemn what he's saying. If they're supporters, they're not going to maybe quite take what he's saying seriously, that he may be joking a bit or that he's just exaggerating. But that's the issue with political violence, is that we're not really thinking about the 999 out of that 1,000 people. We're thinking about that one person who might take that language and say, that's justification for me to take this to the next step. And that's maybe the newer thing that we're seeing, is more rhetoric out there that I could see that one person seeing as justification for going a little bit further.
Taking it to the extreme. One of the problems is that it is difficult to quantify violence, and I think that's what you're talking about. And the reason is ideological motives or relationships can't always be determined.
I mean, as a perfect example, we just talked about Luigi Mangione. Do we count this as a number in the cases that we're looking at?
So let's talk about who Mangione is. He's the guy who went after the guy from U.S. Healthcare.
That's correct, yeah. So, on one hand, this is related to healthcare policies. That seems politically motivated. On the other hand, he talked about his very personal experiences as having related to what he did. So, it seems like there is a personal level to this. It seems like there's a political level. And when we call something political or not, itself is going to be a political question. There's going to be certain acts of vandalism, acts of violence that people are going to say, this wasn't us, or this wasn't really political, this was related groups. So because of the squishiness, it makes it hard to pin down, and it makes it easy for one side to say, really, the other side is more responsible, or vice versa. The best we can do is rely on official statistics. The FBI probably has the best data set on this, but even there, you have to agree with their definitions or not.
Does the fact that there seems to be a lack of accountability in some cases and people getting away with things these days and a lack of regard for the law feed the problem?
I think to a certain extent. If you look at a lot of the people who committed violent acts, these are people that often expect that either they're going to get away with it or they're going to immediately be killed. So it's rare when you get kind of like the middle manhunt kind of situation, but most of the time we see these people come to violent ends pretty quickly, and I think a lot of the time they're ready for that. There's a manifesto printed because they don't expect to survive their attack very long. So I'm not necessarily sure the accountability gets them to think that I won't be held accountable too, but I could see a lack of accountability in politics making them think no one's taking or holding these people accountable. I have to hold them accountable. It should be me that should be taking that into my own hands.
I'm thinking specifically of the January 6th rioters who, look, they stormed the Capitol. What they did was in some people's eyes, just short of treason, yet they were pardoned. And people are saying that sends the wrong message.
So yeah, if you want to step down from maybe murder to something like breaking into the congressional building, absolutely.
And threatening lawmakers.
And threatening lawmakers. I mean, if you see that, several years of court cases go through, several people, dozens of people go to jail, they serve sentences, and then a few years later their sentences are commuted, reduced, etc., you might think that there's less of one condemnation for what you might be willing to do, and there's less consequences that you might face.
Does that send a message to some people that you can get away with it?
For low-level political violence, I think so. I think for high-level political violence, targeted assassinations, the threat of assassinations, if you're playing that game, you're already playing a completely different game generally. But I think for the kind of person that might be on the edge, do I go to this rally which could turn violent or not? These could be those breaking points.
All right. So how much of a role does polarizing politics play in the nation's rising political violence? And there is no shortage of divisiveness out there. We explore that when Politics and Power returns. Welcome back to Politics and Power. Bruce Hamilton with political analyst Sean Frieder. And Sean, polarizing politics might be a part of the equation, and there is no shortage of it these days. But not wholly responsible. Some believe, right or wrong, the violent rhetoric that exists has become somewhat normalized, is I guess the word. People expect it. Have we become that society?
To a certain extent. I mean, there have been studies showing even minor pushes in the way that we use language. Things would be fairly innocuous. Sports language, like competitive language, just makes you a little bit more violent if you tend to hear that, and then you're asked some questions afterwards about your support for violence. Now, these are short-term effects that I don't think are the real cause of this. It's going to hurt most people. I do think polarization does get back to the root of this, and when we talk about polarization, there's two kinds we could really talk about here. There's the polarization of who we are, tribalism, Democrats versus Republicans. And there's the polarization of what we want. If those two groups increasingly want very different things, then elections have consequences in a way that they maybe didn't 40 or 50 years ago when the parties agreed with each other somewhat. So I think both of those things play in. The who we are kind of polarization allows us to think of the other as dehumanized and maybe someone that can accept political violence, and that's perfectly morally okay. The polarization of what we want means that the stakes are so high, maybe this does justify taking action that might be violent.
Are we just in a heightened cycle now? Do we find balance? Because politics is always very cyclical.
That's right. I mean, if we look to the past, if we think about cyclical politics, we've seen back in the 60s, we were at a fairly low point in terms of polarization. If you go 100 years before that, fairly high point in polarization. Now we're back to that fairly high point. So I think in a very long stretch, politics is cyclical, and this might make us think we might come back down to earth, but we also, don't see what does social media existing in 1905 look like? We never get to run that experiment, so there's certain things like social media, other drivers of technology that means we might not come back down to earth, or at least I'm concerned that might be the case in this time.
And what is the arbiter in the future? Is it artificial intelligence? Right. There are so many different things that come into play. John Lewis put the situation we're talking about this way. There is increasing tolerance of the idea that political violence, targeted hate, harassment is okay if it's your in-group against the other side. Your thoughts about that?
That is something that increasingly political scientists feel compelled to study, is what we call dehumanization. That, we have a group of people that are sort of under a moral umbrella. Those people, of course, we would never be violent to, and then there's a group of other people that are not under that moral umbrella. Kind of fair game to do whatever you might want to those people. And I think that as polarization's increased, we've seen that dehumanizing rhetoric happen towards other groups. We've seen people in surveys, even common folk, when asked about is dehumanizing rhetoric okay, we see an increase in the percentage of people that might use it or okay that. So we definitely see that right now.
Is that dehumanization part of Donald Trump's play?
I think that it would be hard to argue that he's not part of that. I mean, if you look at where that dehumanizing language comes from politicians at the very least, I would say the lion's share is coming from him over the last several years. I mean, this has been a decade going now where he's picked out various groups. There's been one study that found that 2016, 2017, he used a lot of we, the people, inclusive kinds of language. Increasingly, he's using them language. This is the group of people doing this. And sometimes it might be domestic. unrealistic. Obviously, we had the example during the debates back in the fall, talking about Springfield, Ohio, where there's an influx of immigrants, and he's saying that, the immigrants are eating your pets. Now, this wasn't happening, but the effect of this very really was to draw a lot of activists to Springfield. It caused problems in the city. There were some incidences of violence that the police had to deal with. So, that's one example of many. That one you can more directly link to him, but I think that there's probably a lot of things that are more indirect.
There's no doubt he's a very different president today than he was during his first administration.
Angrier.
Angrier, more retribution, more wanting to be in charge and more dominating.
And especially you see that with, who he's surrounded himself with. In the first Trump administration, he's surrounded by people who are largely there to kind of handle him, to drag him away from maybe his more extreme impulses. Those people were fired in the first administration, not brought back into the second administration, and those who were brought back into it were mostly yes people. So, he's probably not getting the advice he was maybe getting in the first term to maybe cool it on this language. He's probably more empowered to say that what he wants to say than he ever has been before.
And I think we saw how much in charge he is, how much control he has, and how much, for lack of a better term, fear he's instilled with what happened with the mega bill. For anybody who thought that it wasn't going to pass, for anybody who thought that the Freedom Coalition had any power, look, there was no doubt that that mega bill was never going to fall.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to miss this point that when we think about political violence, we think of one tribe versus another. It's also easy to dehumanize politicians themselves, and it's not even necessarily dehumanizing politicians from the other political camp. One of the reasons we've seen kind of behind the scenes Republican lawmakers talking about that they would pass this bill despite a lot of public opposition to it is that they have privately said repeatedly, we are afraid of being targeted. They've seen other politicians being targeted. In the case of the lawmakers in Minnesota that were targeted. They know that the violent rhetoric could be turned on them. Now, again, Trump is not going to openly call for Republican lawmakers to be attacked, but if he starts saying negative things, it's possible in their minds that at some point them or their families could be in danger.
But I think even more simply, they were worried that they would not have Donald Trump's backing in the midterm elections and they wouldn't be reelected. So that's why they caved, even though, the people, their constituency, would lose their Medicaid funding, even though, the food banks wouldn't be available to them. You did have some like Tom Tillis, who basically said, you know what, I don't care.
Right.
I'm getting out of this game because I'm standing on my principles. But the majority of them were like, my ego wants me to stay in Congress.
At the end of the day, you don't want to lose the election. And increasingly for Republican lawmakers, that election runs through Donald Trump. On a secondary level, which is smaller but very real, you also don't want to lose your life. And I think they're increasingly thinking of things like that.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking, a little bit about that. Not just Republicans, but Democrats too. I think it was Jared Moskowitz from Florida, who basically said, there are those of us who feel fear for our lives, not because of Donald Trump, mind you, but because of, some of the rhetoric that exists out there, because of what happened with those Minnesota lawmakers, because people are crazy, and the Capitol Police can't protect them. They don't have the resources to do that. And because of the mindset of some, people out there who just, are off the wall. Let's face it, though, that rhetoric is indeed a part of the problem. Threats against lawmakers are on the rise in 2024 alone. Let's talk about this. U.S. Capitol Police investigated more than 9,000 threats against lawmakers. That marks an 83% increase from the year before and part of a trend of growing threats against public officials, up dramatically since those January 6th riots we talked about. Lawmakers have gone to their leadership privately and said, this cannot go on. They just don't feel safe. This goes back to what we talked about the beginning of the program, killings in Minnesota. This is not a new problem.
You can go back to Gabby Giffords a decade ago. I mean, politicians, political leaders, they've been assassinated back going to,
Steve
hundreds,
Scalise.
thousands of years ago. But also Steve Scalise,
out playing in a congressional softball game. Somebody targeted.
Congressional Republican playing in a softball game. I mean, we see violent incidences every few years. Now, an 83% increase in threats made to lawmakers, that's one of those things where you can't say, maybe the numbers are just randomly going up and down. 83% is an avalanche increase. I wouldn't feel confident in saying exactly what combination of factors are leading to that. But again, if I saw the number 83% and I was a lawmaker on Capitol Hill, I would be deeply concerned.
Oh, they are deeply concerned. Let me go back to Jared Moskowitz. He had a plot against his life. He said, we're not safe. Our families are not safe. Capitol Police does a great job. They're great people, but they're not set up for this. They don't have the resources. Look what happened to Pennsylvania's governor, Josh Shapiro. they were targeted. It's not just national politicians, it's state politicians, it's local politicians. There's a problem. They do feel targeted, like you said.
Yeah, and as he said, they don't have the resources. Even if we were to increase those resources, let's say 20-fold, I still don't really think they have the resources. Trying to prevent people from targeted assassinations on politicians, that's really a game where the offense has the advantage. If you want to hurt someone bad enough and you care as little about your life in order to cause that to happen, you can give all the resources to investigators, to Secret Service in the world that you want. Things are going to still slip through. So, even if we were to significantly increase their resources, at the end of the day, a very small number of people are very dangerous, which could create a huge problem for lawmakers. They're feeling that, and it's probably affecting their day-to-day political behavior.
Yeah, if somebody wants to get through to you, unfortunately, they're going to find a way. The nation can't let this go on. It's got to find a solution. Maybe the answer is to have America's political leaders condemn political violence. This is pie in the sky. But Robert Pape, who we talked about before, can you imagine this happening? He said the absolute number one thing that should happen is that President Trump and Governor Gavin Newsom do a joint video condemning political violence. Can you imagine that?
It would be hard to.
You've got two people on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but these two guys saying, look, you know what? Got to stop it.
A joint message, I have to imagine, would do something. I would say color me a little skeptical that it would reduce political violence. I think it could reduce support for political violence. When you ask people in a survey, maybe that 20% goes down to 10 or 15% in the few weeks after that. It's something. I mean, every little bit's going to help here. At the end of the day, if you want to reduce political violence, I think you have to target it at the extremely difficult people to target, which is those very few people who actually do commit violent acts. And if you want to go after them, I think you have to do things like significantly increase mental health services in this country, make sure that we do have a functioning healthcare system. And again, we have a loneliness epidemic. I think that we need to be looking after each other more. If you have that relative of yours that disappears into their bedroom for 10 hours a day and they disappear on the internet, you don't know what they're doing, check in on them, make sure they're doing okay. You don't have to condemn what they're doing, let them do their thing, but at the same time, make sure that people that are maybe isolating themselves are doing okay. I think that's probably the number one thing we can do.
Yeah, because sometimes some of those people just want to be heard.
That's right.
They want somebody to listen to them.
Yeah, you're in a great deal of pain. You might decide to eventually inflict that pain on others, but a simple act can kind of disrupt that. I truly think that.
We talked about statistics. Statistics don't matter. The problem is getting worse. This nation, we, the people, need to figure out how to nip it in the bud. And, like you said, maybe it's people having their eyes open to what the reality is. Maybe it's figuring out that we've got, people that are close to us that have a problem, listening to them, helping them, making the mental health resources available. Maybe it is that simple.
At the end of the day, I mean, it's a hard thing to do, but it's also a simple thing to do. To a certain extent, politicians control the resources that go into mental health services. Ask them to put more into it. There's a bipartisan level of support for doing that. But as everyday citizens, what we can do, it's really simple, it's straightforward. Be good to each other, try and take care of one another, keep each other in mind.
That just sounds so simple.
So simple, but so difficult.
It is. All we've got to do is do it. Thanks for watching Politics and Power. Sean, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.